I would just first introduce Sandra Meadows from the Office of Responsible Research Practice, who's going to serve as sort of the moderator for this session. Let her introduce to you our distinguished panel, who can hopefully give you some good tips to get your proposals and your protocols through the IRB process.
Thanks, Stuart. Good morning, everyone, and we're happy to have you join us this morning. I am very happy to have join us this morning some of our very experienced IRB members and IRB leadership. To my immediate left is Karla Zadnik. She is chair of the Biomedical Sciences IRB and chair of our IRB Policy Committee, as well as dean of the College of Optometry and various other academic responsibilities as well. She never stops moving. To her left is Patricia. She is our assistant director in the Office of Responsible Research Practices and serves both as a staff member screening submissions that come into our office, as well as an IRB member reviewing submissions as well. So she sees it from kind of both sides of the process. And then to our far left, we have Craig Hofmeister, and he is faculty in the Division of Hematology and is a member of our Cancer IRB, and has served several years on there, and also has kind of a unique viewpoint from the cancer world. So what we wanted to do this morning first was just to start out by having some wisdom, some pearls of wisdom shared by our panelists. I'm going to start with Ellen, actually, as she is the person who sees submissions that come into our office before they move to the IRB. So when they come into our office, we're going to screen those for components, for responses, and things like that. And so I want Ellen to kind of speak to what are some of the common issues that she sees when those are coming in before they move forward.
So, welcome. Who here has submitted anything to an IRB? Okay, great. So you've worked in Buck IRB, and you've already looked at the application, and you kind of wonder why we ask all those kind of intrusive questions, but they actually, those are the questions in the application are the criteria for approval. So we, the IRB members, have to evaluate your studies to make sure that you answer all those kind of they sort of seem like the same question over and over, but they're really not. We're trying to get at different parts of the things that we need to know in order to approve your study. So when we see things, our staff in the office that supports these IRBs on campus, we look to make sure it's complete. The application is complete. So please do try to answer every question. And please don't put the same answer for every question. So we're looking for different answers in different areas, and so just copy and pasting the same answer in the same, that doesn't work out very well for you. So also, one of the things I think that's really important to make sure that you upload all of these supporting documents. I think a lot of, especially in the social behavioral world, and we're missing one of our members here who is the chair of the social behavioral IRB, they think that filling out the application is all you need to do, but you have to upload a protocol. So what is your plan, your research plan? That is a separate document from the application. And then if you're asking questions of people, survey questions, or you're interviewing, or you have checklists, eligibility criteria checklist, or things you're going to look at the medical record, data collection forms, those kind of things they have to accompany, as well as an informed consent document or an assent document. So the completeness is very critical. And then I think another thing where people forget is important for the IRB members to know is what is the difference between standard of care and what you're doing just for research. So one of the questions asked, what interactions are you doing solely for research purposes versus what you would be doing, for instance, if a participant was a patient in the cancer hospital. So those are the things quickly that I can think of that would be kind of pitfalls.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And then we're going to come to Karla from the Biomedical, having served forever.
It seems like forever.
It seems like forever. What kinds of things have been most commonly encountered by you?
First I'm going to pull back for a minute. So I've chaired the Biomedical Sciences IRB for 15 years, and my joke is always that when I go to cocktail parties and somebody will come up and see my name badge and they'll say, I know your name from somewhere, and I'll say, yeah, I chair the Biomedical Sciences IRB, and they'll say, oh, I need another glass of wine, and they'll turn around and hastily retreat from talking to me. So that reminds me that people often view the IRB as evil, an obstacle, a stumbling block. And I guess what I like to remind people is that I think that the whole IRB system and the Belmont report it's based on, we know the historical travesties that led to needing this system. But when I think about it, there are sort of two extremes. So one way at Ohio State that we could infinitely protect human subjects would be if we did no research, right? Nobody would be hurt. Then we'd all be out of jobs, but no human subjects would be harmed. The opposite of that would be that it was just the wild, wild west, and we all did whatever we thought was the right thing to do, and whatever we could talk a human being into letting us do to them, that would happen. So somewhere in between those fairly absurd examples, to me, is this balance. So this balance where we are protecting human subjects, but also in the business of facilitating research. So when you hear us talk about timelines and improvements we've made to review timelines in the past year or year and a half, that's not for the protection of human subjects, that's the facilitation of the research. Why would the human subjects don't care if the approval of the research is fast or slow? That's really to help all of you get your work done and achieve one of the university's main missions, which is the creation and dissemination of new knowledge. So what I really want you to hear, and I want you to think about it, it's not a tip so much as it's a way to think about the application. The people who review your IRB applications are you. They're just faculty. They are faculty volunteers. They are smart lay people from the community. There are non-scientist members, all dictated by federal regulation. And at the end of the day, they are going to review your materials, knowing the regulations, and make decisions about what you should change, what's allowable, once in a blue moon, research, what research we think might not be approvable, at least in its current form. But for all intents and purposes, that's peer review. It's peer review, just like Don was just discussing with a journal. And so you might say, well, I submitted my IRB protocol once, I got some comments back, and then I resubmitted it, and I answered all those comments, but then I got some new ones. And you know what my answer would be? My answer, if you asked me that, it would not be, oh, that's outrageous, I'm so sorry that happened to you. It will be, it's peer review, and different people, when they read a protocol, might see different things. You may not know how the Biomedical Sciences IRB is constructed, but it is the largest, has sort of the largest workload of any of the IRBs. And we've got, I say we're like Noah's Ark. We've got two of everything. So I've got two radiologists, or I don't at the moment, but I ideally would, two cardiologists, or two ophthalmologists, two neurologists, two pharmacists, two nurses. They're paired up. And we meet every other Monday, but each member of the pair only comes once a month. So it's to keep the workload reasonable. But you could imagine that might be if pharmacist A reviewed your protocol the first time, and then by the time you came back, you went to a meeting where pharmacist B was the assigned reviewer. They aren't the same person. I go to every single one of those meetings, as does one of my 3 vice chairs. And I like to think that we're sort of the people that keeps things calibrated or somewhat reasonable. But I can't always say to pharmacist B, oh, well, that comment you made is stupid, and pharmacist A didn't agree with that. I really have to think of ways to navigate to figure out how to end up with a product that both protects human subjects and allows you to do the research. The only other thing I wanted to say is that at the end of the day, one of the documents that I think we go to, especially if it's in a field that we're not really expert in, but we're an assigned reviewer on the protocol, is your informed consent document. So if I'm reading so I'm an optometrist by training, and let's say yours is a cardiology protocol, and somehow I'm reviewing the informed consent. If I'm reading your informed consent, and I think of myself as a reasonably educated person, and I can't understand it, how could your patient possibly understand it? And so that informed consent document is often the thing I'll go to first. And if it's highly technical terms, if the opening purpose statement is exported from the specific aims page of your NIH grant proposal, and that's what you put in the informed consent that a patient's going to read, that's probably not going to be the right kind of informed consent. I used to say, read it out loud to your smart teenager, read it out loud to your elderly mom, and see if they say, wait a minute, what's that? Tell me what an EKG is again. I've heard that term a lot, but man, you've said EKG 10 times in the last paragraph that you've read to me, and I can't keep in my head what that is or what that's for. So the consent document is also where you do the kinds of things Ellen says. What's happening to the patient because they're a patient in the hospital or an outpatient, and what are what does participation in the research mean uniquely? So the consent document is just, I think, everybody's go-to. If we read the protocol and we don't understand something, or we read the application we don't understand, say, ooh, let's see what the consent document says is going to happen there. And the only tip I would give in this opening is, we are very keyed to consistency across documents. Yeah. So if you say that you're going to enroll 100 people in your protocol, and then your answer to the question and consent form of how many people will be enrolled in this research is 80, what do we think? We think, ooh, a little sloppy, something got updated and the other thing didn't get updated. So right before you hit submit, a quick check of some key things across those documents might be what I see as the number one mistake. And for us who are scrutinizing your work, it's low-hanging fruit. We don't have to understand very much to see the difference between 100 in one document and 80 in another. So those are the kinds of things. Just sounds like housekeeping. But if you're working on something, and let's say you started with a sample size of 80, and then your statistician came to you and said, I've redone that sample size calculation, and we need to change it to 100, right then you think, oh, I'm going to have to change it in all the places that projected sample size appears. So the other thing I would say at the end, but I'll say it as long as I have the microphone, is, aren't we friendly? Don't you think we're nice? Okay? So when you have questions, you know what? You could ask. What a crazy idea. I get emails from investigators, and I'll think, oh, I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that, but Ellen would be the right person to answer that, or another one of the staffers over at ORP would be the right person. We don't bite. We don't think any less of you. We don't take your email and go, oh, that was the stupidest question I've ever heard. I'm going to make sure that finds its way in with the protocol when they review it so they know who they're dealing with. We don't do any of that kind of thing, right? We are really want to help you do the very best research you can do and protect human subjects at the same time. And you need only ask for help across the board. I'm Zadnik.4. I'm the only Karla Zadnik in the universe, so I'm pretty easy to Google as well. And I'd be more than happy to hear from any of you as things arise.
Absolutely, thank you. And to tag on to that, we have really created, hopefully, a convenient way for you to ask questions. If you do have regulatory uncertainty about an aspect of your project or a way that you want your project to be designed or otherwise submitted, and we take, our general number comes to me, and I serve as kind of the first point of contact for questions. So if I can't help you, I will get you to the person who can. So just absolutely to second that motion, please reach out to our office. We're really happy to facilitate your submission process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hofmeister for some words of wisdom.
Good morning. So I am a hematologist. I'm a clinical investigator, treat patients with multiple myeloma. I work at the James, and so I'm going to give you the cancer IRB perspective. Everything in cancer in general is a little bit more protocolized, where the biomedical IRB is the whole thing. In cancer, it starts out as a committee for scientific review, and then the project gets shifted over to the cancer IRB. Nothing really goes to the cancer IRB that wasn't already through and approved by the CSRC, the Cancer Scientific Review Committee. The Cancer Scientific Review Committee has a number of things that are also in some ways protocolized, like, hey, do you have a statistician as part of your protocol? Do you have a statistics section of your protocol? Do you have objectives as part of your protocol? If you don't have these things, don't submit. And that way, in many cases, it forces you to walk a particular walk that ideally heads you towards a balance between no research and overall trying to get good research done. The Scientific Review Committee will look just at your protocol. And along with that comes questions about budgeting and contracting that kind of go along in parallel to try to make sure that a protocol that is prospective or retrospective is able to meet the scientific goals for the whole institution and for the investigator. The biggest hurdle for the Scientific Review Committee is that you didn't have a statistician as part of your protocol, and you don't really think about how the accrual of your subjects is supposed to go. The Scientific Review Committee only looks at your protocol. After the Scientific Review Committee has reviewed and approved your protocol, this is when you start doing a lot more protocolized language. The IRB application has a lot of very set forms. Most of these questions, if you've never done them before, sound very strange. My suggestion to you is find somebody who's done it first. If you want to see an example, email me. I'm delighted to send you an example that's been redacted. The answers to these questions are very specific and do not come naturally if it's your first time doing it. What should come naturally is the consent form, because that's basically what you should be able to talk to somebody about. And really, the Cancer IRB is focused only on the consent form. And for most of the time, retrospective research that is looking at samples is looking at patient protections and how you deal with these samples in an upfront manner. For prospective research, where you're talking to patients, we're trying to assess, is the consent form in any way accurate? And it needs to be. It needs to reflect what's in the protocol. And in fact, copying and pasting from your protocol to the consent while reflecting the protocol is generally a bad idea, because most of the time, patients can't read what's in your protocol. So if you are registry coordinators in this room and you're thinking to yourself that you're going to copy and paste from the protocol into the consent, just smack yourself on the knuckle and don't do it. Just think about trying to make things legible, understandable, and, God forbid, short. A good consent form, like Ben Franklin suggested, is short. So push for that. These are the most common errors that occur when coming to the Cancer IRB, is that most of the time people get through most of the language through the application, but they get tripped up by the consent form because they copy and paste from the protocol. It seems obvious, but this is not generally patient-friendly.
And just to follow up on that too, you had talked about this, the CSRC and having to submit to that. Could you speak just a little bit to when you have something that doesn't have to go to the CSRC, like at the amendment stage, or things that are post initial submission?
It's very interesting. This is a point of contention, actually, and it smacked me across the face just last week, is that in general, when you get something through the Scientific Review Committee, send it to the IRB. And once the IRB says yes, most amendments from there are oftentimes just passed along to the CSRC, hey, just to let you know. It should be that significant scientific changes to the protocol come to the IRB, and the IRB says, hey, why don't you make sure that the CSRC is aware of these scientific changes, because it sure doesn't look like your statistical section is going to be beefed out enough to handle all these scientific changes with the protocol. So most of the time, things will go through back through and notify the CSRC, and that's usually a suggestion. This is also a time if you amend a fully working protocol, which is oftentimes much faster than starting from the beginning again. My suggestion to you is that try to think about it from a reviewer perspective. Wait, I added all these samples. Did I update the sample size? Did I update the statistics? Do the things you would do if you were writing a grant and you added a whole new arm to your study. Of course you need to update the stats. Of course you need to think about pitfalls. All these things are going to come up to the IRB reviewers, and we're going to wonder, did these things get handled appropriately?
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we have, so a show of hands, I know a lot of you have already submitted to the IRB. Is anyone doing research in here that doesn't involve interacting with people, like you're using specimens or data or something other than actual people? Okay, so not too many. Okay, all right. So we'll kind of stay in that realm. For one of the things that we do encounter and comments that I'll hear from investigators will say, basically, why do I have to get informed consent? Because I'm not really talking to anybody. This information is going to come into existence. I don't need to talk to them to get this information. So why do I need to actually go through the effort to ask someone about that? Anybody want to take a stab at that one for why that would need to be?
I can give it a whirl. So if you're doing a retrospective review of data or specimens on the shelf, it was collected for clinical purposes perhaps, and it's, in that instance, it wouldn't make sense to get consent or authorization. Perhaps those participants or patients are deceased, would be difficult to gather, information from them. In that instance, the IRB could you could request a waiver of consent and authorization. However, if going forward you want to collect those samples on an ongoing basis from today on, wouldn't you want, if someone was going to be collecting your information from your medical record, and you had the ability to talk to these people, and you wanted to keep on gathering information, the regulations say that in order to respect their privacy, their confidentiality, their ability to say yes or no, that going forward you would, in essence, you would need to ask for consent and authorization. Sometimes it makes it hard. Sometimes maybe if there's a statistical reason why you have to have every single person with that type of disease say yes, then perhaps you could request a waiver in those instances, and statistically it makes sense. You couldn't have people say no, and you need everyone. But in essence, if you're doing a prospective research and you have the ability to, you should ask people yay or nay if I can use your information. Wouldn't you want someone to do that for you? Any other thoughts?
It's the informed part of consent. I mean, sometimes people will say, I can't put that risk in there because nobody will sign. I can't tell them they might die because nobody will sign up. Well, might they die? Yeah. Pretty rare? Yes, really rare. Okay, so tell them that that's a risk. Tell them how rare it is, and then they, having been informed by you in language they can understand, will get to decide whether they want to participate. That's the concept of autonomy. In addition to privacy and confidentiality,
right.
That's the concept that, they get to decide. Each individual gets to decide. But we have all kinds of safeguards, don't we? Because not everyone has that ability to make a decision. So if you are doing research in patients with Alzheimer's disease, or
Right.
In children, or research on pregnant women, we have special, not that pregnant women can't make their own decisions, I don't mean that, but we have special regulations in place that allow you to have those folks participate in research, but in a way that protects their autonomy as much as we possibly can and informs them as much as we possibly can about the risks that might accrue to them. Mm-hmm. So that informed part is I just say it all the time. It's like you're informing them discussing your protocol with them. It's not like the game is to get them to sign your consent, right? I'm going to give you this consent form, and it's 25 pages long because I didn't follow Craig's rules about brevity, and I'll give you 15 minutes to read it, and I'll be back, and I expect you to sign the last page. That's not what we're doing, right? And consent is a process where, hey, do you have any questions? Would you like to take this home and talk about it with family? Maybe I have a sheet of frequently asked questions. Ask me any questions. Sometimes studies have a patient advocate who can be asked those questions. And when they are fully informed, then it would be appropriate to say, so, are you comfortable with letting me know what your decision is about participating in the work? And if it's yes, then, okay, now we do have a way for you to sign. So there's kind of a difference in those two scenarios I just outlined.
And to that point too, I think we oftentimes think of informed consent as being the document.
Yeah.
But the informed consent is a process. And so there are plenty of types of studies where you may not have a signed document at the end of the informed consent process. And I know we have an example, Dr. Hofmeister, of your project. Would you like to speak to that just a little bit about how you go through the process of obtaining informed consent without having a signed document there?
I think in general, there's so many topics here, but in general, informed consent, if you're gathering it on a patient that you're seeing in any hospital, you should also, they want you to be able to document something to say that I talked with them, they asked these types of questions, I answered in this type of way. This is how the conversation went down. Because most of the time, people who look at this say, wait a minute, that's just a smart phrase, that's crap. And so they really want you to provide some details about the conversation at the same time that you give a consent form, that you have the patient sign the consent form. There are certainly times where you can waive the consent and HIPAA authorization. And one of those times that I was thinking about earlier actually is the registry of retrospectives or tissue banks, where it's quite complicated on when you need to get consent, when you can get samples, the timing, et cetera. This is a great time to ask IRB staff to say, wait a minute, I need 60 glioma patients over this time period. What's the best way to get at this? And what's the least amount of regulatory hassle and the quickest way to get this done? Let's talk with the IRB. Who's done this before? And try not to recreate the wheel.
Right.
This way sounds like a lot of work up front, but will save you an enormous amount of time to get the resources or the samples you need to get your research done.
There are established repositories that can serve as an honest broker at the institution. And because they're doing all of the heavy lifting for you, when you go to an honest broker, you don't have to seek IRB approval in those cases. They're kind of taking care of that process and met all the regulatory requirements to remove you from review of your project. And then there are other repositories that require you to have approval and submit that in order to obtain your requested data or specimens from that. So it really does vary across the institution, and so we strongly encourage you, if you don't have experience with a particular source, either reach out to the administration of that data or specimen repository, or contact our office, and we would be happy to help you kind of navigate what your options might be for that. Other thoughts about specimens?
Well,
Karla?
one is confusion. I often see confusion from investigators on the difference between whether the specimens are de-identified or coded. And the reason, those words don't sound that different. And I think that's part of the problem. And we get lots of protocols that say the data are coded, and we'll look and go, no, they're de-identified, and vice versa. Here's my recipe. So let's say there is a freezer full of blood samples from a particular, maybe it's glioma patients, or and one of those patients calls in and says, hey, you know that tube of blood I donated to that research project last month? I've changed my mind, and I don't really want that to be stored and used in any research. If you can find out which tube of blood belongs to the person on the phone, they're coded. right? There's some, everybody has the proverbial locked file drawer with the folder with the code, 001 is Mrs. Smith. If you can find that out through reasonable means, the data are coded. But if you can honestly say to Mrs. Smith on the phone, yeah, I got that freezer full of test tubes of blood, but I don't know which one's yours, they're de-identified. And anytime I get confused, I sort of apply that simple little test. Patient calls, wants their specimen out of the mix, and you can honestly, truly say you cannot find out whose is whose. That's de-identified. And the reason it's important is that when you read the policy or consult with staff about how to do that kind of research, the regulations that flow downstream from whether you're dealing with de-identified or coded specimens are different. They're different in terms of what you can do, what you can't do. So that's one important distinction, and to me that's the easiest test I always apply to figure it out.
And I haven't officially opened the mic for questions, but please feel free to ask questions, and I will do a quick scan to see if there are any currently
Any burning
out there.
questions about
Anything you
you've
just
submitted
have
stuff
been waiting
and-
all day to ask us? Yes. Mandy, go ahead.
I have two questions for Craig, and they both have to do with the CSRC. One is you have to choose a specialty, check a box that you have to get approval from the person in charge of breast or ovarian or one. What if your project crosses many different? You just choose the one that's fastest, or is there a formula to choosing that?
Work only with your friends and the ones you can influence. The rest, forget. No, in general, they're looking for you at the bottom. You say which group you're going to eventually apply this to. For many research that is not independently funded, it doesn't require utilization of clinical trial office resources. It doesn't matter who you pick. Just pick somebody and it goes within their group. No one cares if you're there looking at samples, et cetera. But if they will care if your trial is utilizing CTO, clinical trials office resources that group essentially has to pay for. Well, now they care very much, and they may not want you in their group. So this is a great opportunity to say, hey, I want to use some of your resources. Will you help me out? And let's barter. This is usually how you choose. The click boxes above just tell you which tumors you're looking at, and you should do whatever. It's not going to matter.
Can you choose more than one?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And then the second question I had is deciding when it has to go to cancer or not. I actually asked Sandra this earlier. So we're thinking of doing a study where we'd be recruiting patients entirely through internal medicine, but it'd be for a cancer referral, screening referral.
Mm-hmm.
So is it a cancer protocol because it's for a type of cancer screening, even though they're not seen at all in any of the cancer institutions? Or because the word cancer is in there, does it go through cancer?
Depends.
I think, in my view, again, it's a lot based on resources and who you're most friendly with. If you work best with the CTMO, the non-cancer clinical trials office, if you have your own resources that do most of their work through Dean Zadnik's IRB, if you're actually more in tune and you're able to accomplish your research best using cancer staff, then I would consider talking with IRB staff, saying, hey, this is the issue, and then say, I'm thinking of doing this, and head that route. In that way, you've gotten some guidance along the way to, in some way, grease the slide.
And sometimes I'll just refer it over to the CTO and say, is this cancer related enough that it should go through CSRC or not? And sometimes we're unsure sometimes. But the Cancer Center is obligated to report to the federal government because it's funded by the federal government with a core grant, that they have to report, prevention studies and cancer related. So sometimes I let them make the call if we're not sure either.
And every once in a while, the cancer IRB has so many conflicts of interest,
Oh, that's a good
they
point.
can't actually convene an appropriate board, and so every once in a while, something like that would come to Biomedical, but that decision's way different than my pay grade, so they just show up, and it's like, oh, we're reviewing a cancer protocol, everybody and their brother must have been co-investigators on that, who's on the board.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
So can I ask
Yes.
one that I'll also answer, just because?
Sure.
So I think a time when, like the cocktail party scenario, is when somebody has gotten back comments and they just think the IRB is plain old-fashioned wrong. They say, who was this reviewed by? Certainly not an expert in autism. You know, it's a complicated protocol involving children with autism, and get back some comments, and you just read them and think, oh, these are just stupid. So what would you do in a case like that? You may say, why don't they assume that I'm the expert instead of asking me these kind of dumb off-point questions? Or you read a comment and say, well, they've mentioned that something's a risk, and I'm not putting that as a risk. I had this happen many years ago when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, and we were going to use a particular eye drop to dilate the pupils of 3-month-old babies, a drug called cyclopentolate, and it came back and said, you need to include on the consent form the risk of tachycardia and seizure. And our first reaction was that silly one I just said, which is, well, we put that down. No mom is signing up their 3-month-old. And then what we did was we looked back. Somebody had done a quick Google search, and what they'd found is an tachycardia was associated with that drug, but only in adults in the literature, rarely. And the second was that there had been one report of a seizure 25 years earlier in a premature infant, and premature infants were excluded from participating in the study. So what did we do? Well, I can tell you, we did not write a "Dear IRB, you are so stupid" letter back, although my IRB has received such letters from people. Instead, what we did was we took sort of a peer review scientific attitude. Gee, we think this is the source of your saying that we should report tachycardia and seizure, and perhaps we should remind you, or that's even too strong, recall that premature infants are not included, no adults are included in this study either, and we took a very academic, scientific approach. No name calling, just like almost an attitude of graciously rebutting what the peer reviewer has told you to do with your work that you think is fundamentally wrong. And that works. Once in a while, before I was on the IRB, I remember going to the same IRB I now chair with quaking knees to refute something that they wanted us to do. And I just thought it was just the wrong thing to do. I actually thought what they wanted us to do in obtaining consent was going to be more coercive than what we were proposing to do. So there's even the possibility of, like going to visit the Wizard of Oz and coming to a convened IRB meeting and talking to us about where we've gotten it wrong, or where your expertise tells you we're asking you to do something that just fundamentally isn't right for your research. And I actually welcome those. I welcome those discussions. But writing us a letter back and telling us we're stupid, even if you think it, is probably not going to get the outcome that you prefer. So a scientific academic dialogue, either on paper or in person, is the appropriate way to deal with that when you just think something's wrong. And sometimes what will happen is somebody will come to the meeting and will say, hey, we read your materials and they said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. And you went, oh, that's not what I meant to say. That's not at all what we're going to do. Oh my heavens, I didn't make it clear enough. Just like when you get a grant review back, the grant reviewer says, I didn't get this. You can say, oh, they didn't read very carefully. You can say, I didn't make that point obvious enough or clear enough, or I wasn't careful enough in my description. So there is still, not that the IRB has absolute jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean that we're not willing to engage in those kinds of academic discussions.
Absolutely, and that's a great point to make.
And certainly you know your research better than the people who are reviewing it, so just convey it as well as you can. Have someone else, as I think someone mentioned earlier. Give your application to someone else and say, do you understand what I'm trying to say here? So if we don't have all the information, then we can't make a decision. And so sometimes in those cases, it has to be deferred and say, we don't have enough information to make a decision. You haven't provided it. We'll ask for some more.
So deferral, if you get a deferral, it's not the kiss of death. It just means that the things we are asking you about, we need to know that information before we can decide whether we can approve it or not. Modifications, that's almost approved, and all that means is that we have given you a recipe. Do this, say it this way, you know, you forgot this part. We tell you exactly what to do. That's when you get modifications required. If there's uncertainty, gee, you didn't mention whether or not you were going to include pregnant women, that's probably going to get you a deferral because we don't know what the answer to that should be, and our decision is going to depend on what your answer to that is. Your informed consent is entirely written in too technical language, that's going to buy you a deferral because we haven't rewritten it for you and told you exactly what it should say.
Absolutely.
On average, there is much more flexibility with the IRB and the CSRC in terms of stipulations than I have experienced when submitting manuscripts.
You're right.
And the reason is that in the manuscript submission, it's a closed world. It's their world, it's their journal, and you get the grace to live in it or pay $2,000 to do so. In the IRB and CSRC, they will often request things, and investigators will often say, no, I can't do that. That's not possible. And, you know, this is a multi-center, and we can't modify the protocol. I'm so sorry.
Right. That's a good
And
point.
the IRB says, no, all right, and moves along. And that never happens in any manuscript I submit, where I request something, they want something different, and if I don't give it, it doesn't go out. And that's not the case in the IRB and CSRC, because it's not a closed system.
Any other questions as we're closed? I know we're winding down.
I think there's a change coming to the common rule which might affect, which is too big to talk
Absolutely.
about probably
Absolutely.
now, but you have some trainings you're going to do, Sandra, in the future?
We do. We're actually next month, on the 17th of October, we're going to be doing a presentation in Prior at 8 o'clock that will kind of introduce the new common rule changes as we're moving towards implementing them here at Ohio State. There's been a lot of uncertainty about these. We've not really been sure whether it was going to happen or not. There's still a lot of missing guidance out there that's going to come. And so it's a little bit of a dance trying to understand and implement based on what information we do have under the new common rule. But you will be receiving a lot of information and a lot of different methods to help you plan for your research after the change is implemented in January. So stay tuned for that. Check our website for presentations and other resources towards that end. Thank you for that question.
So it's not that I hate the common rule, but I have to teach at 11.
Yes.
Thank you, Karla, for being a part of our panel.
So
Thank you,
all for your
Karla.
attention. Call anytime.
And thanks to the rest of you for being on this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.